If you sign that, your company won't survive the week. The words didn't echo. They landed flat, swallowed by glass and steel, like they didn't belong in the room at all. For a second, no one reacted. Not the executives seated around the 12-foot polish table, not the assistants lining the walls, not even Richard Coleman at the head of it, his pen hovering just inches above the final signature line. Then someone let out a quiet breath. Another shifted in their chair. A faint chuckle, quickly buried. And then the silence returned, colder this time. Maya Williams stood near the back wall, her cleaning cart parked just outside the glass door, the faint scent of lemon disinfectant still clinging to her sleeves. The overhead lights reflected off the marble floor beneath her sneakers, turning her reflection into something smaller, flatter, easier to ignore. Her badge, maintenance access, hung slightly crooked against her hoodie. No one had invited her in. No one had asked her to speak. And yet, she had. Richard didn't look at her right away. His eyes stayed on the contract, scanning the final paragraph like her voice had been nothing more than background noise, like the hum of the air conditioning or the distant traffic 30 stories below. Who is she? Daniel Brooks muttered under his breath, not quite quiet enough. A few heads turned now, slow, curious, but not concerned. Just annoyed. Maya didn't move. Her hands were steady at her sides, but her pulse pressed hard against her ribs, each beat loud in her own ears. She could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the tight space behind her eyes. Still, she held her ground. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm, clearer this time, cutting just slightly sharper through the room. "But the data you're using, it's wrong." That got a reaction. Not shock. Not yet. Just a shift. A few executives leaned back. One of the analysts frowned, glancing down at his tablet. Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if the interruption had finally registered as something absurd. "You read one blog and suddenly you're an economist," he said, not even looking at her directly. A couple of smiles flickered around the table, thin and fleeting. Maya didn't respond to him. Her eyes stayed on Richard. He finally looked up, not with anger, not even with curiosity, just a measured, practiced patience, the kind reserved for inconveniences that would be handled in a moment. His pen was still in his hand. "You shouldn't be in here," he said evenly. "Security will, 48 hours, Maya said, before he could finish. The words came faster now, not louder, just firmer. "That's how long you have before the market corrects. And when it does, everything tied to this deal drops with it." The room didn't laugh this time. It didn't move at all. A stillness spread outward, subtle but real, like something invisible had just shifted under the surface. One of the junior analysts blinked twice, then glanced down again at his screen, fingers hesitating above the glass. Maya took a small step forward, just enough for the light to catch her face fully now. "The volatility index has been climbing all week," she continued, her voice steady, precise. "But it's being masked by short-term gains in sectors that won't hold. If you lock this in today, you're tying your entire position to a false signal." Daniel's smile faded, just slightly. Not gone, just thinner. Richard's pen didn't move. It stayed right there, suspended above the paper. For the first time since she spoke, he didn't interrupt. He just watched her. And for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted. Not belief, not yet, but something closer to hesitation. Behind Maya, the hallway lights flickered faintly against the glass, reflecting a version of her that looked small, out of place, easy to dismiss. But the one standing in the room didn't move, didn't lower her gaze, didn't step back, because she had already seen what happened next, and she wasn't going to let them walk into it in silence. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a room like that, 3 seconds felt like a crack forming beneath polished stone. Richard Coleman slowly lowered his pen, not onto the paper, but beside it, the soft tap against the table sounding louder than it should have. His eyes stayed on Maya, measuring, recalculating, as if trying to decide whether she was a disruption or a signal he could not afford to ignore. Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, the faint crease in his forehead betraying a flicker of irritation that had not been there before. "You are basing this on what exactly?" asked, this time looking directly at her, his tone controlled but edged. Maya did not rush to answer. She took one breath, slow and deliberate, the kind that steadied more than just her voice. On the volatility spread between tech derivatives and energy futures, she said. It has been widening all week, but the reports you are using average it out. That hides the spike. A few heads turned again, sharper now. One of the analysts at the far end of the table frowned deeper, his fingers finally moving across his tablet, pulling up charts, numbers, something real to anchor or dismiss what she was saying. The faint tapping of glass screens filled the silence, soft but urgent. Richard's gaze shifted, just slightly, toward that analyst, then back to Maya. "And you saw this where?" he asked. Not dismissive, not accepting, suspended. Maya hesitated for half a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she knew how it would sound. "In the internal projections," she said. "The ones flagged for revision yesterday." Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head again. "That is not possible," he said. "Those files are restricted." Maya met his eyes this time. "They were left open on a terminal in the lower conference room," she replied, her voice steady, without apology. "I was cleaning." The word hung there, heavier than it should have. Cleaning. It settled into the space between tailored suits and polished shoes, a reminder of exactly who she was supposed to be in that building and who she was not. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line, ready to respond. But before he could, the analyst at the end of the table spoke, his voice quieter, uncertain. "Sir," he said, eyes fixed on his screen. "She is not wrong about the spread." The room shifted again, this time more noticeably. Chairs adjusted. Someone leaned forward. Another executive reached for a printed report, flipping pages faster than necessary. Richard did not move much, but his posture changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, his shoulders no longer fully relaxed against the chair. "Explain," he said, not to Maya, but to the analyst. The young man swallowed, nodding as he turned his screen slightly. "The short-term gains we saw this morning," he continued, "they are not supported by long-term stability. If the correction hits, it could cascade." His voice trailed off, but the implication did not need finishing. Maya watched Richard closely. She could see it now, the moment forming, the shift from dismissal to calculation. It was subtle, buried under years of control and authority, but it was there. The beginning of doubt. Outside the glass walls, the city moved as it always did, cars inching through traffic, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, everything looking stable from a distance. Inside, the air felt tighter, like something unseen had already started to tilt. Maya did not step back. She did not soften her tone. "You still have time," she said quietly. "But not much." And this time, no one laughed. Richard Coleman did not look at Maya this time when she finished speaking. He looked at the numbers, or more precisely, at the absence of certainty within them, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if he could feel the shift through polished wood, the kind of shift that did not announce itself loudly, but rewrote outcomes quietly, and that unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could, because it meant he had almost missed it, and men like him were not supposed to miss. Things like this, not at this scale, not with this much at stake. Daniel Brooks leaned forward again, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier had thinned, replaced by something tighter, something that carried weight. "We are looking at a temporary imbalance," he said, though his tone no longer carried the same ease. "These fluctuations happen, they stabilize." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked once toward the analyst's screen, just once, just enough to betray that he was no longer fully certain. Maya noticed it. She noticed everything now, the way the room had shifted from dismissal to quiet calculation, the way people stopped pretending she was invisible and started pretending they had not ignored her. And she understood that this was the moment that mattered most, not the moment she spoke, but the moment they began to listen without admitting it. She took another step forward, slow, measured, not aggressive, just enough to exist in their space without asking permission. "It is not stabilizing," she said, her voice still calm, still grounded. "It is being delayed." A pause, not long, just enough for the words to settle. "There is a difference." One of the senior executives adjusted his glasses, flipping through a printed report, pages turning faster now, less controlled, as if speed could replace clarity. "Delayed by what?" he asked, not challenging, but searching. Maya's eyes did not leave the table. "The data, The invisible pattern she had already traced hours ago in a quiet room no one thought mattered. By artificial support, she replied. Short-term injections designed to hold the line until positions are locked. She lifted her gaze then, directly to Richard. After that, it does not need to hold anymore. The words did not rise, they did not demand attention, but they carried something heavier, inevitability, and that was what made the room still again. Not the idea of risk, but the idea of timing, because timing meant decision, and decision meant responsibility. The analyst swallowed, scrolling again, faster this time, cross-checking, confirming, his breathing just slightly uneven now. There is a pattern here, he said quietly, almost to himself. It is consistent with pre-correction behavior. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand flattening against the table, not striking, just pressing, grounding himself. We cannot pivot an entire strategy based on a theory from someone who accessed restricted data without authorization, he said, the words sharper now. Reaching for control, he could feel slipping. Maya did not react to the accusation. She did not defend how she saw it, because that was not the point anymore. You can ignore where I saw it, she said softly, but you cannot ignore what it shows. Another pause, softer this time, almost quiet enough to miss. And you cannot say no one warned you. That landed differently, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as a line that divided before and after, the kind of line that stayed long after the moment passed. Richard's fingers finally moved, not toward the pen, but toward the tablet in front of him. He tapped once. Then again, pulling up data himself now, not delegating, not relying. The room watched him more than they watched Maya now, because the decision had shifted. It no longer belonged to the room. It belonged to him. And for the first time since she spoke, he did not look like a man certain of his next move. He looked like a man recalculating the cost of being wrong. Outside, the sunlight shifted slightly. Against the glass, casting longer reflections across the floor, stretching everything just a little thinner, and inside, no one spoke, because the next sound that mattered would not be a voice, it would be a decision. The air in the room felt thinner now, like the oxygen had been quietly replaced with something heavier, something that made every breath more deliberate. Richard Coleman's eyes moved across the tablet screen in front of him, scrolling once, then again, slower this time, his jaw tightening just slightly as numbers aligned in ways they should not have. Patterns that had been smoothed out in presentations now revealing their sharper edges under closer inspection, the kind of edges that cut through. Confidence without making a sound. Daniel Brooks shifted in his chair, leaning forward again, but without speaking, his fingers interlocked, knuckles pressing together as if holding something in place. The analyst at the end of the table kept scrolling, faster now, cross-checking across multiple datasets, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet urgency that spread through his posture. Maya stood still, not stepping forward again, not retreating, just existing in that narrow space between being dismissed and being believed. Her reflection stretched across the polished floor, thin and distant, but her presence in the room felt heavier now, anchored by the weight of what she had already said. Richard exhaled slowly, not loud, but enough to break the silence that had been building. "Pull up the overseas exposure," he said, his voice controlled, steady, but no longer casual. The command shifted the room instantly. Screens lit up brighter, fingers moved faster, chairs adjusted as attention narrowed into something sharper, more focused. Daniel glanced toward one of the senior analysts, giving a slight nod, a silent instruction to verify, to confirm, to find something that would restore the balance of certainty they had walked in with. Maya watched as the numbers unfolded across their screens. She did not need to see them to know what they would show. She had already traced that path earlier, alone, in a quiet room where no one had been watching, where the hum of machines had been louder than any voice. "If the correction starts overseas," she said softly, not interrupting, just placing the thought into the flow of their work, "it will hit your leverage positions first." A pause, just enough for the implication to settle. "And those are the ones tied to this deal." One of the executives frowned deeper, his pen tapping lightly against his notepad in a rhythm that was no longer steady. That would trigger a chain reaction. He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The analyst nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. It already is, he said quietly. We just have not seen it yet in the domestic reports. Daniel's shoulders stiffened, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, his expression tightening as the room moved further away from his earlier certainty. Richard's hand hovered over the tablet again, not uncertain, but deliberate, weighing not just the data but the timing, the consequences, the cost of acting too late versus the cost of acting too soon. Maya could see it in his posture, the shift from control to calculation, from authority to accountability. She did not speak again immediately. She let the silence do what it needed to do, let the room catch up to what she had already seen. Outside, the city continued without pause, sunlight sliding across glass towers, cars moving in steady lines, everything appearing stable, unchanged. But inside, the illusion had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for those paying attention to see through it. Richard finally set the tablet down, his fingers resting flat against the table, grounding himself in the present moment. How long? He asked, not looking at Daniel, not looking at the analysts, but looking directly at Maya. The question carried weight now, not skepticism, not dismissal, but something closer to reliance. Maya met his gaze without hesitation, her voice quiet but certain. 36 hours, she said. Maybe less if the pressure builds faster than expected. The room absorbed that number differently than before, not as a claim, but as a timeline. A clock that had already started ticking whether they acknowledged it or not. Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no. Words came, because the argument had shifted beyond opinion into consequence. Richard nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it marked a change that everyone in the room felt, because for the first time since she had spoken, he was not deciding whether to listen to her. He was deciding what to do with what she had said, and that difference changed everything. The number did not echo, but it settled into the room like a deadline carved in glass. 36 hours, not a theory, not a distant possibility, but a window that was already closing. Richard Coleman leaned back slightly in his chair, not in comfort but in distance, as if pulling himself just far enough away from the table to see the full shape of what sat in front of him. His fingers pressed together lightly, not fidgeting, not restless, just still, calculating, the kind of stillness that came before a decision that could not be undone. Daniel Brooks finally spoke again. But his voice had changed. The sharp edge softened into something more controlled, more careful. We would need confirmation across all sectors before we consider any shift, he said, choosing each word with precision, not dismissing Maya now, but not fully yielding either. The room responded to that tone, some nodding slightly, others returning to their screens, searching for something definitive, something that could anchor them back to certainty. Maya watched it happen, the instinct to delay, to verify, to wait for a clearer signal. She had seen it before, not in rooms like this, but in consequences that followed rooms like this. She took a slow breath, the faint scent of cleaning solution still clinging to her sleeve, grounding her in a reality far removed from the polished tension around her. By the time you have full confirmation, she said quietly, it will not matter. Her voice did not rise, did not push, it simply placed the truth where it could not be ignored. One of the analysts paused mid-scroll, his fingers hovering above the screen, the weight of that statement settling deeper than any chart. Richard's eyes shifted back to her, sharper now, more focused. Then what do you suggest? He asked, and the question itself changed the room again, not because of its content, but because of who it was directed to. Maya Williams, maintenance access. Standing in a room she was never meant to influence. Now, being asked for direction, Maya did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood the gravity of being heard. She stepped forward just slightly, enough that her voice would not need to travel as far. Reduce exposure to leverage positions tied to international markets, she said, steady, precise. Delay the signing until you can isolate the risk or restructure the deal entirely. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the contract on the table. The document that had seemed so certain just minutes ago now sitting there like something unfinished, something fragile, that would cost us millions in the short term, he said, not arguing, just stating the reality they all understood. Maya nodded once, acknowledging it without hesitation. Yes, she said, but it will save you from losing everything when the correction hits. The words did not carry fear. They carried clarity, and that clarity moved through the room in a way numbers alone had not. Richard's hand moved again, this time toward the contract, his fingers resting on the edge of the page, not signing, not pulling away, just holding the moment in place. The weight of every decision pressing into that single point of contact. Outside, the sunlight had shifted further, casting longer lines across the floor, stretching reflections into something less stable. Inside, no one spoke. Because the decision no longer needed discussion, it needed action. Richard looked down at the signature line one last time, then slowly closed the folder, the soft sound of paper meeting paper cutting cleanly through the silence. Daniel's head lifted slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to register what had just happened. But he did not interrupt, because he understood it too. The line had been crossed, not in words, but in choice. Richard stood, not abruptly, but with purpose, his chair, sliding back with a controlled motion. "We paused the deal," he said, his voice firm now. No hesitation left. "Reevaluate all exposure immediately." The room moved again, faster this time. Urgency replacing doubt, instructions being followed, data being pulled, the machine shifting direction, and in the middle of it all, Maya stood still, her role already fading back into the edges of the room, as if the moment she created no longer required her presence. Richard's gaze found her one more time. Not dismissive, not distant, but something quieter, something that carried recognition, even if he did not say it out loud. And Maya, without waiting for acknowledgement, turned slightly toward the door, her reflection stretching across the floor again, small, ordinary, almost invisible, but no longer ignored, because what she had said was already moving through everything around them, and there was no undoing that now. The door did not close behind Maya with any dramatic sound, but just a soft click that disappeared into the hum of the hallway. And yet inside the room, everything continued moving faster, sharper, like a machine that had just been forced to change direction mid-motion. Voices low but urgent, screens flickering with updated projections, numbers recalculating in real time. But Maya was no longer part of that center. She stepped back into the corridor where the light felt different, less polished, more honest, the faint buzz of fluorescent panels replacing the quiet intensity of the boardroom. Her sneakers moved across the tile floor with soft, steady steps, the wheels of her cleaning cart rolling beside her, a familiar rhythm returning to her hands, to her body, as if the moment she had just lived belonged to another version of her, one that only existed under pressure, inside glass walls. She paused briefly near the corner, her fingers resting on the handle of the cart, the cool metal grounding her again, her reflection faint in the narrow window beside her, smaller now, ordinary again, the badge against her chest slightly tilted, still reading maintenance access, as if nothing had changed, but her heartbeat had not fully settled yet. It still carried the echo of that room, the weight of being heard, even if only for a moment. Down the hallway, a door opened and closed, footsteps passing without noticing her, people moving through their own routines, unaware of the shift happening 30 floors above the street, unaware of how close everything had come to breaking without warning. Maya exhaled slowly, long enough to release some of the tension still held in her chest, but not all of it, because she knew this was not over, not yet. 36 hours. She repeated it quietly in her mind, not as fear, but as a clock she could not stop watching. Back inside the boardroom, Richard Coleman stood near the window now, looking out over the city, but not really seeing it. His reflection layered over glass and skyline, his hands resting loosely at his sides, while behind him, Daniel Brooks spoke in low tones with two analysts, their voices tight, controlled, pulling in more data, verifying exposures, shifting strategies that had been locked in just minutes before. The energy in the room had changed from certainty to urgency, from control to response. Richard turned slightly, his gaze moving back to the table, to the closed contract, to the space where Maya had stood, and for a brief moment, something crossed his expression that had not been there earlier. Not doubt, not fear, but recognition, the kind that arrived too late to prevent the moment, but early enough to change what came after. He did not say anything about it, did not call her back, did not acknowledge it out loud, because men like him rarely did, but the silence carried it anyway. Down the hall, Maya pushed the cart forward again, stopping. Outside another conference room, smaller, quieter, she reached for the handle, opening the door with a soft motion, the scent of stale coffee and paper greeting her, a space untouched by urgency, untouched by the shift above. She stepped inside, setting the cart beside the wall, her hands moving automatically now, wiping surfaces, straightening chairs, restoring order in a room that had not yet been disrupted. And yet her mind stayed somewhere else, tracing patterns, timelines, outcomes. She moved slowly, not distracted, just aware, the cloth in her hand gliding across the table, catching reflections of overhead light, the same kind of light that had filled the boardroom, the same kind that had reflected off polished surfaces while decisions were made. She paused again, just for a second, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself, because she knew something they did not fully feel yet. The decision they made had bought time, but it had not stopped what was coming, and time, even when saved, still moved forward, steady, unchanging, and somewhere beyond the walls of that building, beyond the reach of their screens and projections, the shift had already begun. The cloth in Maya's hand slowed, then stopped completely as the faint vibration in her pocket broke the quiet rhythm of the room, subtle but sharp enough to pull her attention away from the surface she had been wiping. She reached for it without urgency, but her fingers tightened slightly as she glanced at the screen, a notification, then another, then a third, each one stacking on top of the last. Financial alerts. Market indicators shifting faster than usual, earlier than expected. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in surprise, but in confirmation. The timeline was moving, not waiting. She turned slightly toward the small wall-mounted television in the corner of the room, the one usually left muted, cycling through headlines no one stopped to watch. She stepped closer, pressing the power button, the screen flickering to life, muted anchors speaking with controlled urgency, banners scrolling across the bottom in red and white, early signs of instability overseas, unexpected drops, unusual trading halts, the kind of language that tried to stay calm while signaling something else underneath, something heavier. Maya did not move for a moment, her gaze fixed on the screen, absorbing the pace of the shift, faster than projected, not drastically, but enough to matter, enough to shrink the margin they thought they had. She reached for the remote, increasing the volume just slightly, the voice filling the quiet room. Markets reacting to sudden pressure in key sectors. Analysts are watching closely as volatility increases beyond earlier forecasts. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a bit, not from relief, but from alignment. What she had seen was no longer contained to data. It was moving, visible now, real. Down the hall, footsteps approached, quicker than before, less casual, the energy of the building shifting in response to something not yet fully understood by everyone inside it. The door behind her opened abruptly, not forceful, but without hesitation. Ethan Cole stepped in, his tie slightly loosened, his expression focused but carrying a trace of something else, something closer to urgency than confidence. "I was looking for you," he said, his voice low, steady, but faster than normal. Maya turned toward him, her face calm, grounded, as if the noise from the television and the movement in the hallway were just background. "It started," she said simply, not asking, just stating. Ethan glanced at the screen, then back at her, nodding once. "Earlier than we expected," he replied, stepping further into the room, the door closing softly behind him. "The overseas markets are already reacting, and the pressure is spreading faster than the models predicted." Maya's eyes returned briefly to the screen, tracking the movement of numbers, the subtle shifts that most people would not notice until it was too late. "They need to move faster," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying weight. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then nodded again. "They are trying," he said. "Richard has already called for a full exposure review," but he paused, the word hanging just long enough to matter. Maya looked at him, waiting, not impatient, just aware. "But some of the positions cannot be unwound immediately," he finished, his voice tightening slightly. "There is too much already committed." The room felt smaller for a moment, not physically, but in possibility. Maya absorbed that without visible reaction, because she had already considered it, already seen that part of the outcome in the patterns she traced earlier. Then they need to protect what they can, she said, her tone steady, not emotional, just clear. Ethan studied her for a brief moment, as if recalibrating how he saw her, not as someone who had interrupted a meeting, but as someone who understood the shape of what was unfolding better than most people in the building. "Richard wants you upstairs," he said finally, the words landing differently than anything else that had been said to her that day. Maya did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting once more to the screen, the red numbers continuing to move, the story continuing. Without pause, then she reached for the card handle again, not to push it, but to steady herself for a moment, the cool metal grounding her, the familiar weight of it anchoring her in something real, something constant. She released it slowly, turning toward the door, her reflection catching briefly in the glass of the television screen, small, ordinary, but no longer unseen. "Then we should not waste time," she said, her voice quiet, but certain, and this time, when she stepped into the hallway, the movement around her did not pass without notice, because something had already changed, not just in the markets, but in the way the building itself seemed to recognize that the quiet girl with the maintenance badge had seen it coming first. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that barely cut through the rising noise of the floor, but everything beyond it felt different, sharper, faster, like the building itself had begun to breathe in shorter, quicker intervals. Maya stepped in beside Ethan, the polished steel walls reflecting them back in fragments, her hoodie, his loosened tie, two figures who did not belong in the same frame and yet were moving toward the same place. The same urgency. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence inside the elevator thicker than before, filled with everything that had already started outside those walls, the numbers, the signals, the shift. That no longer waited for permission. Ethan finally exhaled, running a hand briefly through his hair. "The European markets dropped nearly 4% in under an hour," he said, his voice low but tight, as if saying it too loudly might make it worse. "It is spreading faster than any of the models predicted." Maya's gaze stayed forward, fixed on the closing doors, her reflection steady, unshaken. "Because it was never contained," she replied quietly. "It was delayed." The same words, but heavier now, no longer theoretical. The elevator began to rise, the faint hum beneath their feet marking each floor they passed, each second moving them closer to a decision that would carry consequences beyond anything in that building. Ethan glanced at her, studying her for a moment, not questioning, not doubting, but trying to understand how someone standing where she stood had seen what others missed. "How did you know?" he asked, not casually, but carefully. Maya did not answer right away, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her badge, the plastic cool against her skin, grounding. "Because I have seen what happens when people ignore early signs," she said, her voice even, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Not explanation, not defense, just truth. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening to the executive floor, where the atmosphere had shifted completely, no longer controlled, no longer composed. Assistants moved quickly between offices, voices overlapping. In low urgency, screens everywhere displaying live data, red lines cutting downward in sharp angles, the illusion of stability dissolving in real time. Maya stepped out, the sound of her sneakers soft against the carpeted floor, but this time, heads turned, not all of them, not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to register that she was no longer invisible. Ethan led the way toward the boardroom, the glass doors already open, voices spilling out, sharper now, less restrained, inside. Richard stood at the center of it all, not seated, not removed, but actively engaged, one hand braced against the table, the other gesturing toward a screen filled with shifting numbers. Daniel stood across from him, speaking quickly, outlining risks, limitations, constraints, the tension between action and hesitation visible in every movement. Richard turned the moment Maya stepped into the room, his gaze finding her immediately, not by chance, but by intent. The conversation around him did not stop, but it shifted, lowered slightly, recalibrating around her presence. "We are out of time," he said, not loudly, but clearly, the words directed at her, not the room. Maya stepped forward, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving into the space that had once rejected her, now pulling her in. She glanced at the screen, taking in the data in seconds, patterns aligning exactly where she expected, maybe faster, but not different. You still have options, she said, her voice calm, cutting through the layered noise without force. Richard's eyes stayed on her, steady, waiting. Not all of them are good, Daniel added quickly, the edge returning to his voice, not dismissive, but strained. But some are better than none, Maya replied, her tone unchanged. The room fell into a brief, fragile silence, not empty, but focused, every second now carrying weight. Because the market was no longer a prediction, it was happening. And inside that room, the difference between reacting and collapsing was measured in moments, not hours. Maya took one more step forward, the light from the screens reflecting faintly across her face, steady, grounded, and for the first time since she walked into that building, no one questioned why she was there, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them. The numbers did not slow down. They accelerated, each update on the screen arriving faster than the last. Red lines cutting deeper, sharper, like something unseen had finally broken through the surface and was no longer pretending to hold. The room felt tighter with every passing second, not louder, but heavier, the kind of pressure that made every decision feel immediate, irreversible. Richard Coleman stood still at the center of it, his eyes locked on the data as it shifted in real time. No longer reviewing projections, no longer analyzing possibilities, but watching consequences unfold. Daniel Brooks moved closer to the main screen, one hand raised slightly as he traced a pattern across the display. The cascade is starting, he said, his voice controlled but stripped of earlier resistance. If we do not isolate our exposure now, it will pull everything down with it. Maya stepped closer to the table, her gaze scanning the screens, not reacting to the speed, not overwhelmed by the volume, but aligning what she saw with what she already knew. Start with the international derivatives, she said, her voice calm, steady against the rising urgency. They are the entry point. If you contain that, you slow the spread. One of the analysts hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. That will trigger losses immediately, he said, his voice uncertain, caught between action and hesitation. Maya did not look at him. She kept her focus on the pattern unfolding. You are already losing, she replied quietly. This just decides how much. The words landed without force, but they settled deeper than anything else in the room. Because they removed the illusion of choice, leaving only degrees of consequence. Richard's hand moved again. This time not hesitating, not hovering, he turned toward the analysts, his voice firm, cutting through the noise with clarity. Execute the reduction, he said. Now. The shift was immediate. Commands followed, systems engaged, screens updating faster as positions began to unwind. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but decisively. Daniel watched the process unfold, his jaw tightening as numbers adjusted, losses appearing in real time, but smaller than what they could have been, contained, controlled. He exhaled slowly, not relief, but acceptance. Maya stepped back half a step, not withdrawing, just giving the room space to move. Her role already shifting again, from voice to presence, from interruption to anchor. Ethan stood near the edge of the table, his eyes moving between the screens and Maya, the realization settling deeper with every second that passed. Not just that she had been right, but that she had been early, earlier than anyone else in the building, earlier than the systems designed to detect this kind of shift. The domestic markets are starting to react, another analyst said, his voice sharper now. It is spreading. Richard did not look away from the screen, but his posture changed, more grounded, more deliberate, as if the chaos around him had clarified something instead of clouding it. Keep unwinding, he said. Prioritize liquidity, protect what we can. The room moved in sync now, not perfectly, but with purpose, hesitation replaced by action. Maya watched it happen, the machine adjusting, not stopping the fall, but changing its shape, reducing its impact, buying time where there had been none. Outside the glass walls, the city still looked the same, distant, stable, unaware, but inside, everything had shifted, not just in the numbers, but in the way people moved, the way they listened, the way they looked at her. Daniel glanced toward Maya briefly, not long, not openly, but enough to register something unspoken, something that had not been there before, not respect yet, not fully, but the beginning of it. Richard finally looked at her again, his expression steady, but different, no longer measuring whether she belonged in the room, but recognizing that without her, they would have been too late. He did not say it, did not need to, because the proof was already unfolding across every screen, and in that moment, Maya Williams, standing in a room she was never meant to enter, was no longer the interruption. She was the reason they were still standing. The screens did not stop flashing, but the pattern began to change, not in direction, but in intensity, the sharp downward lines softening just enough to signal resistance, not stability, but control, partial, fragile, earned second by second through every decision being executed in that room. Richard Coleman stood unmoving for a moment, watching the numbers adjust, not celebrating, not relieved, but measuring the difference between what was happening now and what could have happened if they had waited. His jaw set, his breathing steady, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something quieter, heavier, the awareness of how close the edge had been. Daniel Brooks leaned over the table, both hands planted firmly against the surface, his gaze locked onto a cluster of figures updating in real time. "The losses are stabilizing," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "We are still taking hits, but it is contained." One of the analysts nodded quickly, fingers moving without pause. "Liquidity reserves are holding," he added. "If we keep this pace, we can ride out the first wave." Maya stood just behind them, her presence no longer questioned, no longer out of place, but also not central to the movement anymore. The machine was running now. The decisions had been made, and what remained was execution. She watched quietly, her eyes tracing the flow of data, confirming what she already understood, that the worst had not been avoided, but it had been reduced, shaped into something survivable. Ethan stepped closer to her, his voice softer now, carrying something closer to respect than urgency. "You were right about the timing," he said, not loudly, not for the room, just for her. Maya did not respond immediately, her gaze still on the screens. "It is not over," she said, her tone calm, grounded. "This is just the first impact." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, the weight of it settling in, because even as the room regained a sense of control, the larger shift was still unfolding beyond their reach, beyond their screens. Richard turned slightly, his attention moving from the data back to the people around him. His leadership no longer about maintaining confidence, but about guiding response. "Prepare contingency plans for the next phase," he said, his voice firm, carrying across the room without force. "We assume this continues." Daniel straightened, pushing away from the table just slightly, the tension in his posture easing, but not disappearing. "We will need to adjust projections across all divisions," he said, already shifting into the next layer of response. The room followed, not chaotic anymore, but focused, deliberate, every movement aligned with the new reality they had accepted. Maya took a small step back, her role naturally receding as the structure reformed around the crisis, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the faint scent of cleaning solution still lingering, a quiet reminder of where she had started just hours ago. Richard's gaze found her again, not by accident, but with intention. He held it for a moment, longer than before, as if weighing something beyond the immediate situation, beyond the numbers, beyond the crisis itself. "You saw this before anyone else," he said, his voice lower now. Not for the room, but for her. Maya met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "I paid attention," she replied simply, the answer not dramatic, not self-congratulatory, just true. Richard nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried acknowledgement, not just of her insight, but of her presence, of her place in what had just happened. Outside the windows, the city still moved, unchanged in appearance. Cars flowing through intersections, sunlight reflecting off glass towers. But inside, the shift remained, not just in the numbers, but in the understanding that control was never absolute, that certainty could break without warning, and that sometimes, the voice no one listened to was the one that saw it coming first. Maya glanced once more at the screens, the red line still there, but less violent, more controlled. Then she turned slightly toward the door, her reflection catching faintly in the glass, still small, still ordinary. But no longer overlooked, because in a room built on power and certainty, she had been the one to see the truth before it arrived, and that truth had already changed everything. The room did not celebrate, it did not relax, it only breathed differently now, slower, more controlled, like something that had just survived a fall and was still deciding whether it had truly landed. The screens continued to update, but the violence in the numbers had softened, no longer collapsing, now correcting, still unstable, but no longer spiraling. Richard Coleman stepped away from the table for the first time since the shift began, his movement measured, deliberate, as if testing the ground beneath him. He walked toward the window, looking out over the city that still appeared untouched, distant traffic moving in steady lines, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings that gave no sign of what had just unfolded inside one of them. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass, layered over the skyline, and for a moment, he did not look like the same man who had nearly signed that contract. Daniel Brooks remained at the table, reviewing updated figures, his posture still tense but no longer rigid. The resistance that had once defined his tone replaced by something quieter, something closer to acceptance. "We contained most of the exposure," he said, not loudly, just enough for the room to hear. "If we had locked in that deal." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The implication settled into the space between them, heavy and undeniable. Maya stood near the edge of the room now, no longer at the center, no longer guiding the movement, just observing the aftermath, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence steady, grounded. She did not look at the screens anymore. She looked at the people, at the way they moved differently now, the way their voices had lost their earlier certainty, replaced by something more careful, more aware. Ethan glanced toward her again, then back to the data, as if recalibrating both at the same time, understanding not just what had happened, but who had made the difference. Richard turned back from the window slowly, his gaze moving across the room until it settled on Maya again. Not quickly, not casually, but with intention. He walked toward her, each step quiet against the floor, the room noticing without interrupting, because something in that movement felt just as significant as the decisions that had come before it. He stopped a few feet away from her, not too close, not distant, just enough to speak without raising his voice. "You could have walked away," he said, his tone even, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Not accusation, not assumption, but recognition. Maya met his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged. "Yes," she said simply. Richard nodded once, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer, as if weighing the meaning behind that single word. "But you did not," he continued, the statement quiet, but deliberate. "Maya did not look away, because it was not just your company," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "People would have been affected, jobs, families, things you do not see from a screen." The words did not accuse, they revealed, and they landed in a way that numbers never could. Daniel's gaze lifted briefly from the table, his expression tightening slightly, as if those words reached something beyond the immediate situation. Ethan remained still, listening, understanding more with each second. Richard exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, the kind that did not come easily, especially not in a room built on authority. "You chose to help anyway," he said, quieter now. Maya gave a small nod. Nothing more, no explanation, no need to justify. Because the choice had already been made, already proven. The silence that followed was not empty, it carried weight, respect beginning to take shape in a space where it had not existed before. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the decisions that had just changed the outcome of countless lives tied to numbers on a screen. Inside, something else had shifted, not just in the market, but in the way one person was seen. Richard straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not entirely the same. "Stay," he said, not as a command, not as authority, but as a request. Subtle, almost unfamiliar in its tone. Maya looked at him for a moment, then glanced briefly at her badge, still hanging against her hoodie. still reading maintenance access. A quiet reminder of where she stood in this building. She lifted her eyes again, steady, grounded. "I have work to finish," she said, her voice calm, not dismissive, not defiant, just honest. Richard did not respond immediately, but something in his expression shifted again, understanding settling where expectation once was. And for the first time since the day began, the room did not see her as someone who needed permission to be there, but as someone who chose where she stood. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something too fundamental had shifted, not just in the numbers or the decisions, but in the way silence now carried meaning. Maya's words still lingered in the air even after she had turned toward the door, her steps quiet against the floor, steady, unhurried, as if she had not just altered the course of a billion-dollar decision, as if she were simply continuing what she had started hours ago, the work no one noticed until it was not done. Richard Coleman remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching her move away, not with urgency, not with authority, but with something quieter, something closer to reflection than reaction. Daniel Brooks glanced at him briefly, then back at the table, the numbers still updating, but his focus no longer entirely there, part of it following the space Maya had just left behind. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving between Richard and the door, sensing the moment. Stretching, not breaking, just evolving into something unspoken. Richard finally moved, not toward the table, not toward the screens, but toward the door Maya had just passed through. Each step measured, not rushed, as if he was not chasing her, but catching up to something he had not seen clearly before. The hallway outside was quieter now. The earlier urgency diffused into controlled movement. People still working, still responding, but no longer reacting blindly. Maya stood a few feet away from her cart, adjusting the handle slightly, aligning it with the wall, restoring order in a way that felt almost symbolic after everything that had just unfolded. Richard stopped a short distance behind her, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Maya," he said, her name steady, unfamiliar on his tongue, but deliberate. She turned slowly, not surprised, not guarded, just present, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, without expectation. Richard paused for a fraction of a second, as if choosing words that did not come as easily as numbers or decisions. "I was wrong," he said. The sentence simple, direct, carrying more weight than anything else he had said that day. The hallway did not react. No one turned. No one stopped. But the moment held its own gravity. Maya did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, absorbing not just the words, but the effort behind them. Because acknowledgement like that did not come from habit. It came from change, small, but real. Richard continued, his voice quieter now, not weaker, just more honest. "Not just about the data," he added. "About you." The words settled differently, deeper, because they reached beyond the situation into something more personal, something that had been present long before the numbers started moving. Maya glanced briefly at her badge again, the plastic catching a faint reflection of the overhead light. Maintenance access, the same label, the same position, nothing about it had changed, and yet everything around it had. She lifted her eyes back to him, her expression calm, grounded. "You were not the only one," she said softly, not accusing, not dismissing, just stating a truth that extended beyond one person, beyond one room. Richard nodded slowly, the acknowledgement landing fully this time, not resisted, not deflected, just accepted. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was clear, like something that no longer needed to be filled. Ethan appeared at the edge of the hallway, slowing his steps as he approached, not interrupting, just present, witnessing something that mattered in a different way than the numbers ever could. Richard straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not unchanged, something in it more measured now, less absolute. "We are going to review everything," he said, not as a statement of control, but as a commitment. "The way we see risk, the way we see people." Maya listened, not reacting outwardly, but something in her stillness suggested she understood the weight of what he was trying to say, even if it was incomplete, even if it would take time to become real. She gave a small nod, nothing more, not accepting praise, not rejecting it, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. Then she turned back toward her cart, her hand resting lightly on the handle, the familiar metal cool beneath her fingers, grounding, steady. Richard watched her for a second longer, then turned back toward the boardroom. The work still waiting, the consequences still unfolding. But the perspective no longer the same. And as Maya began to move down the hallway again, her reflection faint against the glass panels, she did not look larger, she did not look different, but the space around her had changed, because now, when she walked past, people did not look through her. They noticed, even if only for a moment, and sometimes, that was where change began. The building felt quieter that night, not empty, but settled, like something that had been pushed to its limit and had finally stopped shaking. The lights in the upper floors still on, still reflecting against the glass, but softer now, less urgent. The screens inside no longer flashing with sharp red lines, just steady updates, controlled movements, the kind that came after the first wave had passed. Maya Williams moved down the hallway with the same steady pace she had carried all day, her hands guiding the cleaning cart as the wheels rolled softly over the polished floor, the faint scent of lemons still trailing behind her. A small, ordinary detail in a day that had been anything but ordinary. She stopped outside the boardroom again. The door slightly open this time. Voices inside quieter, no longer tense, just focused, measured. She did not step in. She did not need to. She could see enough through the glass. Richard Coleman standing near the table, sleeves rolled slightly, no jacket now, his posture still firm but no longer rigid. Daniel beside him, reviewing final numbers. The two of them speaking in low tones, not arguing, not resisting, just aligning, something that had not been possible hours ago. Ethan sat at the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on a screen, but his attention drifting now and then toward the door, as if aware of the space just outside it. Maya watched for a moment, not long, just enough to understand the outcome. The company had not collapsed. The losses had been contained, not avoided, but shaped into something survivable. People would keep their jobs, families would not feel the impact in the way they could have. And inside that quiet realization, there was no celebration, just a subtle shift, a difference that would not make headlines, but would matter in ways no one in that room would fully see. She adjusted her grip on the cart and continued down the hallway, not waiting, not lingering, because her place in the story had never been about staying at the center. It had been about stepping in when it mattered, and stepping out when it was done. The television screens mounted along the corridor now displayed calmer updates. Analysts speaking in measured tones about unexpected early warnings that had helped certain firms reduce exposure. Phrases like proactive adjustment and timely response moving across the screen. But no names, no faces, just results. Maya passed by without stopping her. Reflection faint in the glass, small, quiet, unchanged on the surface, and yet everything around her carried the echo of what she had done. The elevator doors opened as she approached, the soft chime blending into the background noise of the building. She stepped inside, alone this time, the polished metal walls reflecting her back in fragments again, but steadier now, more grounded, the badge against her chest still reading maintenance access. Still the same words, still the same role. The elevator began to descend, each floor passing with a quiet hum. The city lights growing closer through the narrow gap of the closing doors, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of timing pressing against her chest. Just a slow, steady inhale, then release. When the doors opened on the lower level, the air felt different, cooler, simpler, untouched by the decisions made above. Maya stepped out, guiding the cart forward, the wheels catching slightly on the edge of the tile before rolling smoothly again, the rhythm returning, familiar, grounding. She moved toward the exit, the glass doors reflecting the night outside, streetlights casting long lines across the pavement, the world continuing as it always did, unaware of how close things had come to breaking. She paused briefly before stepping out, her hand resting lightly on the cart handle, the cool metal steady beneath her fingers. Then she pushed forward, the doors opening with a soft motion, the night air meeting her quietly. No applause, no recognition, just the sound of distant traffic and the hum of a city that never stopped. And as she walked into it, her figure blending into the ordinary flow of people and light, there was no sign of what had happened, no visible mark of the difference she had made. But somewhere, high above, in a room of glass and numbers. Decisions had changed because she spoke, and that was enough, because she did not change the world that day. She changed the outcome.